I suggest a Clark Nova Portable. It has Mythic Resonance.
Clark Nova. Like a typewriter?
Hello and welcome to Mythic Resonance. My name is Andrew Elmore, and today I'd like to introduce a video series called One of Those, in which we take a look at a selection of games that make up a highly specific category of their own and explore a loosely organized series of thoughts and observations about what makes them interesting. Today we're going to look at the small collection of first-person mech-based dungeon crawler shooters of the early 32-bit console era. This all began when I was discussing this very topic with Roman Assert of the GraveRobber Foundation, a fellow dungeon crawler sicko who has made some truly excellent and unique entries in the genre. More on those later. This led me to make a thread on the Insert Credit forums where we tried to create some kind of shorthand term for this kind of game. Dungeon Mecha got shortened to DungMech, and user Corey suggested the brilliant Speclunker. I've since used those two terms interchangeably. I'm still fascinated with them, and now I've got some capture equipment, so here we are. It's time to make a video for the internet, I guess. No one asked for this. Now, it's important to specify what we're talking about here, because there are innumerable first-person shooters in the early to mid-90s from the perspective of a mech pilot. Metal Jacket, Extreme Power, Gun War, Gun Griffin, Iron Soldier, roughly 900 Gundam games, the list goes on and on. But I'm specifically interested in the sub-genre of games that use the language of first-person mech shooting within the structure of a dungeon crawler. I should probably stop and explain what these games actually are. They're slow-paced first-person shooters with the structure of classic dungeon crawlers. The levels are small in scope, consisting primarily of long hallways with maze-like layouts and minor puzzles reminiscent of Zelda or Resident Evil. The levels are usually organized in floors, and the player is tasked with climbing the floors of a massive tower structure, or else descending deeper into an underground bunker, or maybe exploring the infrastructure of a massive space station. This progression is sometimes strung together with interstitial dialogue, cutscenes, and other cinematic-style narrative tools providing context, motivation, and world-building for the player. The moment-to-moment gameplay is modal, usually balancing between firefights with robotic enemies and hunting for key cards or other interactive elements of the environment. The same could be said for a game like Doom, but Doom is a fast game, with open areas and deftly crafted combat encounters. These DungMech games are much slower and more claustrophobic. They're closer to Doom 3 in that sense. You're not a space marine subsisting on pure rage and adrenaline. You're an industrial mech pilot in a confined space, very carefully checking your corners and playing it safe. DungMech combat encounters typically play out with the rhythm of an early Rainbow Six game.
Mission failed.
The most crucial identifying factor of these fights is the tight hallways and small rooms. Your enemy shots may be slow, but there often simply is not enough room to dodge those projectiles. You're going to get hit. These fights are tiny wars of attrition. You need to be able to outdamage your opponents again and again, revitalizing yourself with healing items every so often. It's less a battle for survival and more a management of precious resources. You're trading ammunition for health and vice versa. You're playing for geographical control of doorways, bedrooms, kitchens, freeing up space to safely navigate as you investigate each floor, in search of something that will open up the elevator so you can move on to the next floor and do it again. It's the kind of gameplay loop that feeds itself with ruthless efficiency, like a perpetual Ouroboros. Speclunkers, as we know them, draw direct influence from their predecessors in the PC-88.
And here we go. It'll print farts forever, which is wonderful.
Such as Dimensional Fighter Epsilon 3, Carmine, Weebarm. cutscene. All very complex and ambitious systems-driven games from 1985 and 86 that combine the tile-based dungeon crawling of early RPGs like Wizardry and Black Onyx with arcade-style first-person shooting. Almost exactly a decade later, studios like Genki found themselves able to leverage the processing power of these newly 3D-capable platforms to bring a new level of fidelity and experimentation in the genre in the earth-shattering wake of first-person dungeon-crawling shooter masterpiece of atmosphere and action that is Doom. No, we're not talking about Doom clones, but to ignore the immediacy of its impact and global influence would be irresponsible. This second wave of DungMech shooters is, as far as I can tell, kicked off by Tetsujin, Iron Angel of the Apocalypse, by Synergy for the glorious 3DO in 1994. Tetsujin is a game that traffics in heavy atmosphere and shadows, using the hardware's strengths and weaknesses with thoughtful sincerity to create an experience that works as precisely as well as it needs to. There's a utilitarian sort of mood to it. It's lean and skeletal, but it's not devoid of meaningful interactivity, not by any means. It's not a horror game, but it certainly borrows some of that visual language. That's a common theme that we'll see with Speclunkers. Long liminal hallways of industrial corrugated metal, presented in beautifully crunchy textures woven from big chunky pixels paneled and repeated ad nauseum. You will get lost. That's okay, that's the point. The genre's aesthetic in this era is marked by its most obvious creative and technical limitations. Limited financial budgets, incomplete hardware documentation, tiny texture memory, very low polygon counts, tight development timelines, the list goes on and on. All of this influences the design of the game based on what was and was not realistically feasible to pull off within those limitations, which in turn, of course, determines the player experience both directly and indirectly. Directly, in that you have a handful of games with very obvious walls and facades. Indirectly, in that those facades create a unique sort of experience that, for some players, adds up to much more than the sum of its parts. Tetsujin also received a sequel on the 3DO that simplifies things a little bit, focusing primarily on being more of a straightforward first-person shooter while raising the bar for production value across the board. It's very impressive. It's a little less of a dungeon crawler in spirit, but the moment-to-moment gunplay feels better, and it's got an incredible sense of tone and atmosphere. My favorite part of the whole thing is the art direction and the motion graphics work, though. I mean, just look at this for a minute. It's phenomenal.
So, now we see if you've got what it takes to be Tetsujin. It's battle time.
There's a sort of shared identity across these games that weaves together their mechanics with their aesthetics, and that identity is the core of what I find so fascinating about them. Where a game like Silent Hill succeeds in hiding its draw distance in a bright gray fog, these DungMech hallways fade to an inky, abyssal blackness that visually implies a lonely, infinite void. Of course, there's almost never going to be anything out there in that void but more industrial hallways and maybe a few enemies. Maybe, if you're lucky, there'll be some kind of bespoke environmental detail that will give you a better sense of scale and of the nature of the space that you're inhabiting. Genki's Killy trilogy on PS1 is the most elaborate expression of the form to date, having fleshed out the core concepts into an experience with an exceptionally high meat-to-bone ratio, so to speak. The games aren't generally RPGs in the traditional sense, despite the common lineage they share with their dungeon crawler peers. They generally stay in the lane of first-person shooting and navigation and minor puzzle solving, but Killy, Epidemic, and Beltlogger 9 all showcase this level of polish and interactivity that places them on another level above their peers. There's a broader variety in aesthetics. Your mech has higher mobility across 3 dimensions, and the player has far more verbs at their disposal. The level design is more detailed and open, extending from the familiar hallway crawling up to jumping flash-style 3D platforming in large open spaces with moving geometry and flying enemies. They give you more elaborate puzzles to solve and more tools to solve them with. The third and final entry of this trilogy, Beltlogger 9, or Brahma Force, depending on your territory, is perhaps the most elaborate expression of the genre. And as a result, I think it's also the most approachable to a newcomer. If you have any interest in games like this and are looking for a place to start, that would be my first recommendation. It feels the most, well, modern? On the opposite end of that scale is Genki's Saturn entry, Robotica, or Daedalus, depending on your region.
Others began to protest the notion of living under the restrictions of what they saw as an increasingly archaic system. Clashes began to occur with increasing frequency between these two groups, with Daedalus repeatedly trying to suppress them. On the surface, these were but minor conflicts. Underground terrorists from the reformist faction were arming and steadily growing in strength. Their first operation will be an attempt to destroy Daedalus itself.
Robotica is thoughtfully designed around the Sega Saturn hardware's limitations, eschewing the open areas of Epidemic and Beltlogger 9 in favor of the long, dark hallways of corrugated metal that we know and love. The game largely follows a pattern from level to level, asking you to find a keycard in order to open an elevator to progress to the next floor. Textbook Speclunker material. What sets Robotica apart from its peers like Tetsujin, however, is largely the kind of advancements that come with time and hardware. The hardware is just more capable internally and externally. The Saturn Pad has 3 more face buttons than the 3DO pad, and it's much more capable of rendering 3D games, even if it's still a long shot from the PlayStation in that regard. Additionally, Robotica has a handful of interesting little systems unto itself. One of my favorites is the auxiliary battery carried by your mech. You can cycle through different special items at any time, and then hold a button to expend the battery's charge toward that item. This includes things like recharging your shields, activating a hoverjet for increased movement speed, beefing up your attack power, activating a temporary invincibility shield, or smart bombing every enemy currently on radar. That stuff is exciting in the moment-to-moment gameplay, but for me what makes Robotica special is what makes all of these games special. The thrill of entering a space that is essentially a miniature RPG dungeon, learning and internalizing that space, solving its esoteric puzzles, finding secrets and opening false walls to hidden passageways, managing resources and shootouts with enemies, uncovering small details about the world and the environmental design, and then moving on to the next floor and to do it all again. Building off of previous knowledge and experiences as the picture of the game as a whole begins to take shape. It's all very Metroid-esque. These fundamental aspects of the DungMech experience were revived in 2018 by independent Ukrainian developer GraveRobber Foundation with a lovely game called Das Geisterschiff, followed closely by Der Geisterturm and Der Geisterjäger in 2020 and 2021, respectively. If you want an excellent modern version of the Speclunker with a striking visual style and one of the best original soundtracks I've heard in years, that you can just get on Steam and play right now, grab any or all of those. Whether you want to call them Speclunkers or DungMechs or mech-based first-person explorative dungeon-crawling shooters, it's a very specific kind of game that really only could have ever come into its own in the environment that birthed it. Taking inspiration from experimental PC-88 games and thriving in the novel new era of real-time, creamy 3D graphics and the limitless multimedia power, of the CD-ROM, all during the meteoric rise of the first-person shooter. If you're interested in more and better writing on this kind of game, I highly recommend Beltlogger 9, Storytelling, Strafing, and Sci-Fi, a piece by my favorite games writer, Kimimi, the game-eating she-monster. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Please let me know how you feel about this new kind of project in the comments below, and I'll see you next time on the other side of Inner Zone.